recording. Okay. So here's a boring wall of text, but the short of it is Unity events will let you more modularize function calls to be able to be set in editor without and then once you set this up, you realistically don't have to keep like editing your scripts to add behavior related to like this event. So one good example is item pickup. So item pickup could consist of many things. It could be made of actually like updating the inventory. It could be playing a sound effect. It could be playing a particle effect. It could be like updating like an enemy to say, hey, something got picked up. You should go hunt down the player. But this is a nice way of hooking all of that up without actually having to edit the script every time you want to add or remove any of these behaviors. So now let's actually, oh, and this is a very nice way of signaling to designers and like non-programmers to be like, hey, you can add things here, because being pestered every 2 seconds to try to add something kind of sucks. Like, I'm not gonna, harp on non-programmers, but isn't it nice if you can just say, hey, go do this thing right here that I don't have to keep, editing every time. But yeah. So now let's actually talk about Unity events, and they are a class that will let you bundle functions. And I use the word functions, but like methods are a subset of functions if you're more familiar with that word. So it's just a way to bundle your calls to like bodies of code. So, and yeah, Unity events in particular are visible in editor, which is again really nice for designers because then they don't have to touch your code, etc. So now let's break down what's available in the class. So there's 3 main methods of Unity events that you should care about. One is invoke. That says call all the functions tied to me. So this will just go down the list like top from bottom and be like, let me call you, let me call you, let me call you, let me call you, let me call you. And I don't think I say it. The next most important is add listener, and this is for more the coding side. This is how you add a function to a list of functions. So this says, I'm going to register this function into this Unity event, so call this when invoke is called. And then the flip side is remove, which is you get rid of it. So now there's slight limitations on Unity events. You can only have 0 to 5 argument functions in the Unity event. This is just a slight. I honestly don't know why it's limited like that. It's probably to make sure you don't just do infinite arguments and start really going crazy on the function listing. So these are kind of limited. So now here's an example of using it in code. So up here I've defined a function. Yay, mouse person. I've defined a function called a. It just takes an int as an argument and just, prints that out in the debug log. So in start, this is how I'll make a Unity event that takes one int as arguments. So you'll notice it has chevrons by the Unity event type. And that's the same as generics in Java, or these are just template parameters to say, hey, this is the list of types that I will accept as arguments. So if you did 0 argument, you wouldn't need the little carets, the chevrons. And if you had more arguments, you would list them like left to right, same order as like your function list. So then, I'm just making a new Unity event, standard like 0 argument constructor. And so here's me adding listener. And so here I'm adding a to the list of functions in the Unity event. And below, I'm also adding a function called foo, because you can add multiple here and, assume foo exists somewhere else. I just, added this to show you can add more at once. And for, okay. Is that better for everyone? I probably should have done that. Oh, well. And also there's, so you can also add functions from different classes because, foo was kind of assumed to be part of this class, but, or part of this class. And then bar, for other, you can assume that exists, and you can add that function even though it's from a different class. Yes.
So You have to add functions that have the same
Yes, the
argument,
same
right?
argument signature.
So it's got to be all ins, all strings, all booleans.
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
so if you wanted to have like some that are ins and some that are booleans, you have to make separate unity event objects for those, right?
Yes.
All right.
Yes, that is a good question. The type is very strict because it's a class that tries to bundle it. And under the hood of what's happening is even though you pass the function name as the argument, Unity's actually, or at least C# is actually bundling like both the class and what function to add. So it actually will know like which object do I want to call this function on. But it's also very important to note that it will keep objects alive since it still keeps a reference to the source object. So this might be a source of like some memory problems if you added it to an event and didn't remove it, adding a function call to an event and not removing it. So now that I've added some events, let's actually call, or added some functions, let's call it. And it's as simple as events.invoke, and then you pass it the arguments as if you were calling the functions originally. So now events.invoke 5 would go down the list and start with A, say, okay, let's call A while passing it the argument 5, which would print 5 to the debug log. And then it would call foo, passing it the argument 5. And it would call call bar, passing the argument 5. So it's just a nice way to bundle all these function calls and call them in one place. Yes.
So if other was a model behavior on the game object, and you destroyed the game object.
Yes, if other was a mono behavior from a game object that's dead, the mono behavior actually wouldn't be like fully deleted yet because it's added to listener, so the reference to the object will still exist. So I think that'll just cause an error. I'm not quite sure because I actually haven't done it myself. But it'll cause memory problems is what will definitely happen though. Everyone good so far? Okay. So now let's actually dissect how it looks in the editor when you actually expose it. So up here, it's so much easier to point. You can select whether or not the Unity event can only be called during runtime, which is like during gameplay or like during play mode in the editor. Only in the editor, which is in the editor, which is more for buttons that you would use for debugging and like editing scenes and stuff like that, or both. So down here is where you would select the source game object. So what game object do I want to call functions from? And you notice how I said I'm calling it from the game object because up here, when you open that list, it'll actually list every component attached to this game object, and you can call any public function off of those components. And then for at least one argument, so if there's no argument, you actually wouldn't see this box. It's like, oh, I can call it, even though the Unity event may, take arguments. And that'll work because Unity is going to bundle it together and pretend it takes arguments, and then, ignore it entirely. But if it takes one argument, you can preset what that argument is. So in this example, every time you hit the button, it will always call B with argument and pass it to argument 0. Yes, Grant. So yeah, this will actually appear on the inspector. This example is pulled from the button UI object, like default made object. And yeah, this will just appear in the inspector, along with every other field that's visible on the inspector. No, it depends. So now you're wondering, what happens if I have more arguments? Because this only works on one argument case. If you have more arguments, or you want to make the arguments depend on how invoke is called, we have the other use. So now you'll note, I probably should have linked a picture, but in the 0 or 1 argument case, they'll actually be listed as static and below. That's because it's saying, hey, the arguments are set in place, they never change, I'm going to set them now. But if you want the arguments to depend on the how invoke is called, like invoke 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, then you have to use dynamic. So dynamic will, like I said, depend on the invoke call. And you'll notice there's no option to set arguments. That's because you're entirely relying on how the invoke is called. You good so far? And I don't remember. Okay, this is the last slide. So that's sort of the brief overview. Let's actually go to an example of making something more Unity event, driven. So in the starter project, or starter stuff that I gave y'all, go into the events folder, open scenes, and open events. So you'll notice in this game right now, all it does is, I can collect a coin, it plays a particle effect, and it doesn't play sound because it hates me dearly. Trust me, and you'll probably hear it on your own machines, but it will play sounds. Oh god. Okay, now it works. Oh no, wait, it's coming from you. But yeah, that still proves my point. It's just simple coin collecting. So now let's actually look at what's inside. So I'm going to click on the player. I'm going to scroll down to the bottom of the inspector. And I'm going to double click on player inventory's text box. And I have Sublime. You'll probably have, your favorite text editor. And so you'll notice the script just looks like this. This is all of it in its entirety. So just assume add items being called correctly, like on collision. So what's happening is I'm manually finding the particle system and telling it to play. Manually finding the audio source and telling it to play. And that kind of sucks, because what if I realize I don't want to play particles on this coin collect? Then I have to open the script, delete it, and save it, make sure it works, etc. Oh, what if I wanted to add the particle system back? Again, I have to open the script, etc. You see how annoying this can become if you really want to make lots of changes? So what we're going to do is actually replace these two lines with a simple Unity event. So let's do that. So up at the top, you actually have to add using Unity event engine.events. So this will contain all the stuff about Unity events, and Unity just kind of assumed that you wouldn't use it by default, even though it's so nice, and so they just moved it elsewhere. So now let's actually add the Unity event. So right above inventory, I'm going to make a new line. I'm going to put public Unity event on collect. Semicolon. And so public will make it visible in inspector. I'm not doing more advanced stuff, even though that is available. And so it's just a simple declare it, and it'll be there. And Unity, even though I'm not assigning it anything, because it is a Unity type, Unity, when it actually makes the components, will automatically make it for you. So now it's actually a really simple change. I'm going to take this right here and hit backspace. Goodbye forever. And so all I have to do is call the invoke on collect.invoke. So now instead of having that very rigid list of what to do on collection, I just go ahead and say, I'm going to punt this to whatever the designer puts here. I'm going to leave it up to other people to figure out what to do in this case. So now, I'm assuming everyone's okay with typing, since, yeah. So now if we go back to Unity, it'll do its, compiling, it'll rethink about what this player inventory looks like. And magically, there's a new field here for the Unity event. So now, let's actually add those particles add the sound and particles back on. So if you hit the plus sign here, that's how you add a new function to list on this event. So now I'm going to drag the source game object, and since my particle effects and audio are on the player, I'm going to drag player from the hierarchy into this first box. So now you'll notice the drop down on the right is now, clickable. So now if I open this up, you'll notice it lists all the game object functions and every component on this game object. Oh, sorry for going a bit too fast. Let's show them this real quick. Yes. So what was here previously was get component, particle system, and get component. Audio source, I completely removed them and replace it with onCollect.invoke. Okay, is anyone not done writing the... Okay. Okay, I'm sorry, but oh yeah, and don't forget to write this line. Oh, well, this line up here, and this line right here. The 3 highlighted lines are the things you need. Okay, anyone not done? We're good. Okay. Now back to my odd rant. So yeah, you'll open it here and you'll notice, it lists every single function, available. So now game object, has a couple things, but in particular we care about, let's say, the particle system. So, this is all the 0 or 1 argument particle systems that can be statically set in this event. So the one we care about right now is play. So I'm going to select particle system, play, and just go ahead and click it. And now you'll notice it's added to the event. So now if I play the scene, yay, particles are hooked up. And I didn't have to go back and add the code in. I just had to do it in Unity, in the editor. So, particles are hooked up. Let's go ahead and hook audio back up, even though you can't tell from the setup. So now like we did with particle system, we just hit the plus sign to add a new function to list. But this time, I'm going to show you all a neat trick. So you notice this black circle right next to where I dragged and dropped before? If you click on it, it'll actually open a window to show you all the objects that can be put in here. So now, I want the player from the scene. So I'm going to click in the Scene tab, and I'm going to search player. So now you'll notice it'll look for every game object in the scene with the name player. So I'm going to click player, and then you'll notice it got selected in the box. So now that's selected, I can just close this box. And just like before, I'm just going to open the functions, find the component I want, and audio source has a lot of options, let me tell you. But yeah, play is near the bottom. And I'm going to go ahead and just put that back on. So now if I hit play on the scene again, you'll just have to trust me that audio works. Oh, is it? I think it's different people. Oh, okay, it was just quiet. But yeah, now we've hooked you'll see how I've basically hooked up the same functionality, but there's so much less code writing. So much less, back and forth. I just have to leave this little hint for other people to say, add your stuff here. So, any questions, really? Because that was sort of my bit. Yes.
When you say audio source at play, how do you know which audio source?
So, yeah, that's because I listed player, it at least knows it's going to be an audio source off the player. But if you have multiple of the same component on the same game object, you actually can't tell which one will play. That's sort of one weakness of Unity events, that, you know, multiple components aren't expected behavior. I mean, the quick fix is to, like, add a component, add a child game object, you know, like, right-click here, create an empty, and then add a new audio source right here, and then, you know, reference this game object instead. But, yeah. Yes. So the problem, you know how I said the source is a game object? Even if you drag the component in, it'll go back and say, hey, what are components attached to your game object? So again, it still won't, you know, work that way. Yeah, it's a bit rigid, but, you know, I don't want to touch my code again. You know how annoying it is to find which one to open? No, he means to fix the double component thing.
Do you want to show the dynamic?
Oh, yeah. Let me show you a very quick example of the dynamic function call. So, back in player inventory, I'm basically going to recreate the example I made in my slides. I'm going to call public, I'm going to make a public void A that takes an int argument A, and I'll just debug.log A. So if y'all aren't familiar, what this will do is just take the argument it gives, print it in the debug log, and yay. Yay! So now, actually, it actually was a very important point to talk about the multiple arguments. So the problem with Unity is that if you want something listed in the inspector, it can't be a generic class. So it can't have, like, templated arguments listed. Instead, you have to do a small trick like this. You have to make a public class. Let's call this test. And this extends Unity event of type int. And it'll just have an empty body because I don't want anything else. So what this trick does is makes this generic class pretend to be a concrete one, because I'm setting what test is forever and ever. So now, like with the normal Unity event, I'm just going to declare a new variable, public test, on test. So that'll be the same as any Unity event. And just to scroll down, I'm going to highlight what I put on. Oh no, that's not right. Okay, there we go. Okay, is anyone still who's not done typing? But yeah, and going forward, if y'all do need like a generic type, this is how to go about making a generic type visible in Inspector. You just make a concrete version that's like, you know, that pretends to be it. That is a trick that I have had to use a couple times. But yeah. Oh, and I'm actually going to add one more thing. I'm going to say, I'm going to onTest.invoke here. And even though this is kind of bad, I'm going to just cast this to an int and say, I'm going to take the item. Oops. No, Sublime, I don't need you now. So what this will do is, because item is an enumerated type, this just converts it back to what the value is. So, you know, if this were the 5th item, it would just return 5, etc. So yes, is anyone not done typing? Okay. So now we'll go back to Unity, click back on the player, and let Unity think about it for a moment because it has to remake the component. It's going to think really hard about this one and then not work because I actually forgot something very important, which is I have to add the attribute system.serializable. What? I'm not using system. So I'm being lazy because I just need one thing. So I'm directly, going through the whole path to get serializable. And what this attribute says is it says to Unity is that this is probably viewable in Inspector. You might need to check still, but it's just a little hint to Unity that it should be viewable. There are more complicated backgrounds into this that I will not explain. It is very complicated. Okay, now that Unity had its moment to think again, so now we have a new thing called onTest that takes one integer argument. So now I'm going to go ahead and add, I'm going to add a to this as I did with the particle system using the plus sign, drag the player in, and then go picking the function from player inventory. And instead of, so you notice, since this Unity event takes arguments, it now separates the functions into dynamic and static. The static is like what I had before, where I can preset what arguments are called. Dynamic says, I'm going to depend on invoke. So because we're doing dynamic, I'm going to depend on invoke. So I'm going to do the above one, yes. Did you make onTest? Did you do this? These two lines? Did you do this line? Did you do this?
Make sure that it's public again.
Yeah. Oh yes. You can only call from the. This is actually a very important distinction. If you do things programmatically, you can actually, or if you do things using add listener, you can add private functions to the Unity events. However, if you do it in Inspector, you can only add public functions to the event. Okay. So now that we have this set up, test is now calling a dynamically. I'm going to click over to the console right here, hit play, and you'll notice some numbers will start appearing. And the number will depend on what coin you collected. So if I collect blue, it's a 2. If I collect red, it's a 1. If I collect yellow, it's a 0. And that's because it's dynamically taking what the enumerator was and just, throwing it out there. Another important thing to note that I kind of forgot, if you do want this to be listable in Inspector, the argument types are actually restricted. You can only have primitive types like integers, floats, strings, or Unity types, which are like game object, audio source, any mono behavior, which is a script, So this is kind of limited just because Unity wanted to make sure they didn't have to deal with too much while still giving you a lot of room to put things in. But yeah, collect things, watch the numbers go. Any questions? Again. Oh. I just directly cast it, even though it's an enumerator type. Yeah, this is kind of ugly. I was just doing a quick and dirty, setup.
When you use string items, will print out the color?
No. So if you want to print the enumerator, you can actually just directly print the enumerated value. But that goes into other topics. Any questions? Any lingering concerns?
So,
Unity events.
So what if you wanted a second argument that was not that?
So you want one argument that's static and one that's dynamic. So, if you have this very stupid case, let me tell you, you actually do have to, you have to do it purely programmatically. Like, you'd have to do it in your code, and you couldn't have Unity, like, do this halvesies with the argument. And if you want to learn more about that, I suggest you look up lambdas, because I don't want to describe the complexities of lambdas right now. I am not prepared. Is that it? Well, that's all I have for you. Thanks for coming.